The town of Willow Creek was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to change. The streets were lined with old oak trees. The diner still served the same biscuits and gravy it had for 30 years, and on Sunday mornings, the church bell carried farther than any other sound. For most folks, that church was the beating heart of the community, and Pastor Elijah Franklin was its steady pulse. Elijah was a man in his late 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a voice that could fill the sanctuary without a microphone. His sermons were the kind that made people cry, not because he shouted or threatened hellfire, but because he spoke with a quiet conviction that seemed to come straight from God. Widows leaned on him for comfort. Young couples sought his advice before marriage, and even the stubborn farmers who rarely left their land tipped their hats when he walked by. To the people of Willow Creek, Elijah wasn't just a pastor. He was a symbol of trust. And that was exactly why Rebecca Cole let down her guard. Rebecca was 52, a woman who had lived enough life to carry both strength and sorrow in equal measure. She had lost her husband to cancer 5 years earlier and had convinced herself that love was behind her. Her days were filled with simple routines, tending her garden, baking pies for church events, babysitting her granddaughter when her daughter worked late shifts. Yet no matter how busy she kept herself, the evenings were always quiet, too quiet. Loneliness had a way of seeping into the cracks of her resolve. When Elijah first began to notice her, she thought it was only pastoral kindness. He would stop by her pew after service, ask about her health, offer to pray with her. But soon the conversations stretched longer. He lingered at her front porch after delivering groceries, his hands wrapped around a cup of her sweet tea. There was a warmth in his eyes that startled her, gentle but unmistakably personal. "Rebecca," he had said one late afternoon as the cicadas sang in the trees, "I believe the Lord brings people together for reasons we may not see at first. Sometimes healing comes through companionship." Her cheeks flushed, the way a girl's might, though she hadn't felt that way in decades. That night she whispered a prayer of thanks, daring to believe that maybe, just maybe, God was giving her a second chance at love. The courtship was slow, deliberate. They held hands at picnics, prayed together before meals, and spent long evenings talking about scripture and memories of loved ones they had lost. To her friends, Rebecca confessed her surprise. "I never thought I'd feel this again," she told her closest confidant, her voice trembling between joy and disbelief. "Elijah makes me feel seen, truly seen. I think he's the answer to prayers I stopped praying years ago." Her friend smiled knowingly. "He's a good man, Rebecca. The best man in town. If you can't trust him, who could you trust?" It was a sentiment that echoed everywhere she turned. At the ladies' Bible study, women nudged her with teasing smiles. At the grocery store, strangers congratulated her as though the whole town had already decided their fate. And in her own heart, Rebecca allowed herself to hope again. By the time Elijah proposed, on bended knee beneath the wooden cross inside the church, Rebecca didn't hesitate. Tears blurred her vision as she said yes, and the congregation erupted in applause when he announced their engagement the following Sunday. It felt as though heaven itself had sanctioned their union. For Rebecca, the thought of walking down the aisle again was nothing short of a miracle. She believed she had found not only a partner, but a man whose soul was aligned with hers through faith. She trusted Elijah with her heart, her future, and her reputation in a town where whispers travelled faster than the wind. She had no idea that within days, that trust would shatter in ways she could never have imagined. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and golden, as if the heavens themselves had opened a curtain of light across Willow Creek. The church, which had stood for over a century with its steeple rising proudly against the sky, had never looked more alive. Stained glass windows sparkled with the sun, and the air outside carried the scent of magnolias mixed with fresh-cut grass. Rebecca stood in the small bridal room with her daughter fastening the last buttons of her lace gown. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with awe. She never thought she would wear white again, never thought she would have this kind of joy after years of widowhood. She caught her reflection in the mirror, a woman not young anymore, but radiant with hope. Tears filled her eyes, and her daughter touched her shoulder gently. "Mom," she whispered, "you look beautiful. Daddy would be so proud you found happiness again." Rebecca's heart swelled. For a moment, she felt her late husband's presence, almost as though he was blessing her from beyond. She clasped her daughter's hand. "This isn't just happiness," she said softly. "It feels like a miracle." Inside the sanctuary, every pew was filled. Families dressed in their Sunday best, neighbors, friends, and even those who barely knew the couple, all came to witness the union of the town's beloved pastor and the woman who had endured so much sorrow. There was laughter, quiet chatter, and the occasional sound of hymnals being opened in anticipation. When the organ began to play, the crowd rose to their feet. Rebecca's daughter walked her down the aisle, and Rebecca felt as if time had slowed. She saw familiar faces blurred by her tears, saw children waving shyly, saw the glow of candles along the altar rail. And at the end of that aisle, standing tall in a black suit with a white clerical collar, was Elijah. His eyes were fixed on her, steady and filled with admiration. For a brief moment, she forgot the world existed outside of that gaze. The applause of the congregation, the ringing of the church bell, the whispered amens, all faded into silence. There was only him. When she reached the altar, Elijah took her hand with a firmness that steadied her trembling fingers. His palm was warm, his grip protective. They turned toward Reverend Matthews, a retired minister who had come to perform the ceremony. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began, his voice deep and reverent, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and in the presence of these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The words rolled like music. Rebecca listened, heart pounding, as vows were spoken. Elijah promised to love her in sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow, until death parted them. She echoed the promise with her own trembling voice, feeling the weight of the covenant and the sweetness of its hope. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Elijah leaned forward and kissed her hand before pressing his lips gently against hers. The congregation erupted in applause. Women dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs, men clapped firmly, children giggled at the excitement. The church shook with celebration. Later, in the fellowship hall, the reception carried the joy into laughter and music. Long tables were laden with fried chicken, potato salad, and peach cobbler, southern staples brought by every family in town. The choir sang lively hymns, and couples danced shyly in the corner while children chased each other between chairs. Rebecca and Elijah sat together at the head table, hands clasped, smiling at everyone who came to congratulate them. "This is God's work," one deacon declared as he shook Elijah's hand. "I've never seen you so happy, Pastor. She's a blessing to you." Another woman leaned down to Rebecca, whispering, "You're the luckiest woman alive. Every one of us wished we had a man like him." Rebecca blushed, her cheeks glowing, and glanced at Elijah. Yet, as her eyes lingered, she noticed something, an almost imperceptible shadow crossing his face. For just a split second, while no one else was watching, his smile faltered. His jaw tightened as if under strain. His eyes flickered with something like fear. She pushed the thought away. Surely it was only nerves. After all, a pastor carried heavy burdens. He was now not just a leader of the church, but also her husband. The responsibilities must have weighed on him. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Rebecca leaned her head on Elijah's shoulder. He kissed her forehead tenderly, whispering, "Tonight begins the rest of our lives." Her heart swelled at the words. She believed him. She believed in the promises spoken at the altar, in the applause of their friends, in the sacredness of their covenant. She had no way of knowing that within a single night, that dream would unravel into a nightmare. The reception had ended in laughter and song, but when the last car pulled away from the church parking lot and the town of Willow Creek grew quiet again, Rebecca felt her chest tighten with anticipation. Tonight wasn't just another night. It was the beginning of a new chapter, the long-awaited intimacy of marriage, the sealing of vows spoken before God. She held Elijah's hand as they walked into the modest house the congregation had helped him renovate years earlier. A soft summer breeze drifted through the windows, carrying the scent of honeysuckle. The moonlight spilled across the floorboards like a silver blessing. Rebecca excused herself to change into her gown, white silk with lace trim, something she had bought timidly weeks ago, blushing in front of the store clerk like a young bride. She brushed her hair, applied a touch of perfume, and paused in the mirror. Her face was older, her body bore the marks of age, but her eyes gleamed with a light she hadn't seen in years. When she stepped into the bedroom, Elijah was already sitting on the edge of the bed, shoes off, his suit jacket folded neatly over a chair. He looked up at her, and for a moment his face softened with something that looked like awe. "You're beautiful," he said simply. His voice cracked as if the words carried more weight than he intended. She smiled, her nerves settling. "And you, Pastor Franklin, are now my husband." She tried to sound playful, tried to cut through the heaviness of the moment. But Elijah's shoulders stiffened. His eyes shifted, not away from her, but inward, as if he were bracing himself against something unseen. Rebecca crossed the room, took his hand, and whispered, "We're married now. Tonight, there's nothing between us but love." His hand trembled inside hers. She leaned in to kiss him, slow and searching, but when her fingers reached for him, he pulled back sharply. "Elijah?" she asked softly, her brow furrowing. He exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. "Rebecca, there's something I need to tell you." A chill slid down her spine. She tried to laugh it off. "You're not getting cold feet now. The vows are already said." But he didn't laugh. He looked at her with an expression that mixed shame and desperation. "I wanted to tell you before. I prayed every night for the strength. But I couldn't. I thought, maybe love would be enough." Her pulse quickened. "What are you talking about?" He swallowed hard, then stood, pacing the room. His broad frame looked suddenly small, diminished under the weight of his confession. Finally, he turned to her, tears welling in his eyes. "Rebecca, I can't give you what a husband should. I was born without the part of me you're expecting tonight." His voice broke. "I don't have it. I never have." The words struck her like a blow. For a long moment, the room fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. She blinked, certain she must have misheard. "What do you mean?" Her voice was trembling now, rising in pitch. "You can't mean." But he didn't answer with words. Instead, with a look of tortured resignation, he loosened his belt, unbuttoned his shirt, and revealed the truth. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, one hand covering her mouth, her other clutching the edge of the dresser as if it could keep her upright. "No!" The word slipped from her lips, barely a whisper, then louder. "No! My God! Elijah! My God!" He rushed toward her, reaching out. "Rebecca, please. Please try to understand. It doesn't change who I am. It doesn't change the love I have for you. We can still have a life built on a lie," she shouted, shoving his hands away. Tears streamed down her face, hot and relentless. "You married me. You stood in front of God, in front of the whole town, and you never said a word. You let me believe. I was afraid," he said hoarsely. "Afraid you'd leave me. Afraid the church would turn its back on me. I thought if I just gave enough of myself in every other way, maybe it would be enough." "Enough." Her voice broke into a sob. "You've stolen from me, Elijah. You've stolen my trust, my dignity. You've made me a fool in front of everyone." He dropped to his knees, clasping her hands with desperation. "Rebecca, don't leave me. You're the only one who's ever loved me this way. Please, God brought us together for a reason. We can find another way. We can." She yanked her hands free, her whole body shaking. "Don't you dare bring God into this. God honors truth, Elijah, and you've lived a lie." He flinched as though she had struck him. His eyes brimmed with tears. "I am still the man who prayed with you, who held you when you cried, who—" "You are not the man I married," she interrupted, her voice cutting sharp as glass. "That man died the second you opened your mouth tonight." The silence that followed was suffocating. Rebecca's sobs filled the room, broken by Elijah's labored breathing. The love she thought she had found had dissolved into a nightmare in less than an hour. Finally, she stepped toward the door, clutching her robe tightly around her trembling frame. She turned back only once, her face streaked with tears, her voice steady with fury. "I will not stay in this house tonight, and by tomorrow I will not stay in this marriage." The door slammed behind her, the echo rattling through the parsonage like a final judgment. Elijah collapsed onto the bed, burying his face in his hands, while Rebecca stumbled into the night, her heart shattered, her faith shaken to its core. The sun rose quietly over Willow Creek, casting its first light on a town that still slumbered in peace. But inside Rebecca's small kitchen there was no peace, only the pounding of her heart as she sat at the table, staring into a cold cup of coffee she could not bring herself to drink. The night replayed in her mind like a cruel film. His confession, her screams, the unbearable truth. Her body felt hollow, as though the joy of the day before had been sucked out, leaving only shame. She could still feel the way Elijah had clutched her hands, begging her not to leave, insisting that love should be enough. But love, she knew, had to be built on truth. And the truth had been ripped from her like a rug pulled out from under her feet. By 8 o'clock, she had already made up her mind. She changed into a plain dress, pinned her hair back, and pulled herself together as best she could. This was not about anger anymore. It was about dignity. She had been fooled once, and she would not be fooled again. The county courthouse sat at the center of town, a red brick building with white columns that looked more stately than it truly was. Rebecca pushed open the heavy wooden doors, her heels echoing against the marble floor. She felt every eye on her, though in truth most people paid her no mind. She marched straight to the clerk's office, her jaw tight, her eyes dry from a night that had wrung her of tears. The clerk, a woman with sharp glasses and a bored expression, looked up from her paperwork. "Can I help you?" Rebecca's voice was steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the counter. "Yes, I need to file for divorce." The woman blinked. "Divorce? Honey, are you sure? You just got married." She glanced at the calendar on her desk, then looked back at Rebecca, her brow furrowed. "Yesterday." Rebecca met her gaze without flinching. "Yes. Yesterday, and today I want out." The clerk hesitated, clearly curious, but she slid a form across the counter. "Well, you'll need to fill this out. It's unusual, but it's your right." Rebecca took the pen in hand, her signature flowing across the paper with a firmness that surprised even her. Each stroke felt like carving a line between who she thought Elijah was and who he had revealed himself to be. As she handed the papers back, the clerk leaned forward. "People are going to talk, you know. A pastor's marriage ending this quick. It'll spread like wildfire. Rebecca drew in a sharp breath. Let them talk. I'd rather endure whispers than live a lie. When she walked back outside, the church bells began to ring across town, announcing morning service. The sound stabbed at her like knives. She knew Elijah would be inside that sanctuary, preaching as though nothing had happened, wearing the collar of authority he had no right to wear. The thought twisted her stomach. At the diner later that morning, the gossip had already begun. She walked in for a cup of coffee, needing the familiar comfort of routine, but conversations hushed the moment she entered. Heads turned. Eyes followed. Someone dropped a spoon into a cup too loudly. "Is it true?" a woman finally asked, unable to restrain her curiosity. "You left him already?" Rebecca set her purse on the counter with deliberate calm. "Yes, it's true." The room buzzed with murmurs, some sympathetic, others disapproving. An older man at the back muttered, "Cold as ice." Poor pastor didn't even get a chance. Rebecca spun around, her voice sharp as a whip. He had a chance. He had years to be honest. And he chose silence. The diner fell quiet again, her words hanging in the air like smoke after a gunshot. By afternoon, the story had spread to every corner of Willow Creek. Some called her brave. Others called her cruel. But Rebecca didn't care. She returned home, locked the door, and sat alone in her living room. For the first time in years, she felt something unexpected. Not peace, not joy, but a flicker of power. She had chosen truth over appearance. She had chosen dignity over humiliation. That night, while Elijah stood at the pulpit preaching to a fractured congregation, Rebecca sat by her window watching the streetlights glow. She whispered into the silence, "Lord, forgive me if I am wrong, but I will not be broken by lies." The divorce papers were filed. The marriage, less than 24 hours old, was over, and in the quiet of her home, Rebecca knew that this decision was only the beginning of a storm that would shake not just her life, but the entire town. Sunday service in Willow Creek was never meant to be a battlefield. For generations, it had been the one place where everyone could sit side by side, no matter their quarrels during the week, and find a measure of peace. But that morning, only a day after Elijah Franklin's wedding, the church pews were filled with unease instead of harmony. Word of Rebecca's filing for divorce had spread faster than wildfire. It was the kind of news that leapt from porch to porch, whispered over fences, carried on the lips of those who had been at the wedding feast less than 24 hours earlier. By the time the first hymn was announced, the sanctuary buzzed not with worship, but with speculation. "Did you hear?" whispered Mrs. Parker, a widow in the second pew. "She marched into the courthouse this very morning. Said she wanted out before the ink on the license had even dried." "I heard it was because he lied to her," another woman murmured. "About something personal." She lowered her voice to a hush, glancing around before adding, "Something a wife has a right to know." The whispers rippled across the room, bouncing from pew to pew like sparks in dry grass. No one had the full story, but everyone had enough pieces to know something was terribly wrong. At the pulpit, Elijah cleared his throat, the Bible open before him. He stood tall, his clerical collar pressed against his neck, but his face was pale, his eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. He began with the usual invocation, his voice steady at first, but lacking the usual fire. "Brothers and sisters," he said, "today I come before you as always, a servant of the Lord, committed to guiding you in his word." But he could feel it. The congregation's eyes weren't on the pages of their Bibles. They were on him, watching, waiting, judging. Halfway back, Deacon Harris leaned toward his wife. "He's dodging it. He thinks he can stand up there and pretend nothing happened." His wife hushed him, but her own brow was furrowed with suspicion. Elijah tried to continue, preaching on forgiveness, on the need to look past human failings and focus on divine mercy. But the words rang hollow. He could see the skepticism on faces that once beamed at him. He could hear the coughs and sighs of those who once leaned forward eagerly to catch every syllable. After service, instead of the usual laughter and fellowship, the church lawn became a storm of whispers and heated debates. "I tell you he deceived her," a man declared firmly, arms crossed. "A pastor's supposed to be a shepherd, not a liar." "Deceived? That's harsh," another countered. "Maybe he had reasons. Maybe it wasn't his choice. Doesn't the Bible say love covers a multitude of sins?" "That ain't love," the first snapped. "That's betrayal. If he lied about something that deep, how do we know what else he's hiding?" Nearby, Rebecca's name surfaced again and again, some in tones of sympathy, others in disdain. "She's right to leave him," one woman insisted. "A marriage without truth is no marriage at all." But another shot back. She humiliated him. Couldn't she have kept it private? Didn't she vow to stand by him? The arguments grew louder, neighbors glaring at one another, old friendships strained by sudden loyalty tests. What began as whispers had become open division, right there on church steps. By mid-afternoon, the scandal had reached beyond the congregation. At the diner, at the feed store, at the gas station, people took sides. Some swore Elijah was still a man of God who deserved compassion. Others demanded he step down from the pulpit entirely. That evening, a special meeting was called by the deacons. The fellowship hall filled with voices raised not in prayer, but in accusation. Deacon Harris stood, pounding his fist on the table. "This church cannot stand on lies. Pastor Franklin has disgraced this pulpit. If he cannot be honest with his own wife, how can he be honest with his flock?" But Mrs. Whitfield, a long-time member, rose with fire in her voice. "Who among us hasn't hidden something out of fear? Are we so quick to cast stones? Maybe God gave us this test to teach us about grace." The room erupted into a chorus of shouts, some demanding resignation, others calling for patience, others insisting on silence until more was known. Through it all, Elijah sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of quiet agony. He did not rise to defend himself. He could not. The truth, once hidden for decades, now lay exposed. No sermon could cover it. No prayer could erase it. At home that night, Rebecca sat by her window, listening to the muffled hum of cars passing by. She knew the town was divided, knew her name was being torn apart in gossip as much as Elijah's. But she did not regret her choice. She whispered to herself, steady and resolute, better to live hated for truth than loved for a lie. And as the town of Willow Creek settled into uneasy silence, one thing became clear. This was no longer just a broken marriage. It was a scandal that threatened to fracture the very heart of the community. The parsonage had never felt so silent. For years, Elijah Franklin had called the modest house beside the church his refuge. Its creaking floors, its old wooden furniture, its shelves lined with Bibles and sermon notes. It had always been a place of prayer, of preparation, of peace. But now, the silence pressed down on him like a punishment. He sat in the dim light of his study, the curtains drawn, his clerical collar tossed carelessly onto the desk. In front of him lay an open Bible, the pages worn from decades of use, but tonight the words blurred into meaningless lines. His hands trembled as he tried to read, the verses slipping away from him as though even Scripture refused to give him comfort. The image of Rebecca's face haunted him, her eyes wide with horror, her voice trembling with betrayal. "You've lived a lie." The words cut deeper than any blade. He had built his life around preaching truth, guiding others to walk in honesty before God. And yet, the truth he had carried within his own body, the secret he had borne since birth, had been hidden under layers of silence and fear. He leaned back, covering his face with both hands. "Lord, why did you make me this way?" His voice cracked in the empty room. "Why give me this burden if it would only end in disgrace?" No answer came, only the faint hum of cicadas outside and the steady tick of the wall clock. Memories surfaced, unbidden. He was 12 again, standing in the doctor's office while his mother wept quietly in the corner. The doctor had spoken in clinical terms Elijah barely understood, words about malformations, about what was missing, about what would never be. That day, his childhood ended. He remembered his mother's trembling hands on his shoulders. "Don't you ever tell anyone," she had whispered fiercely. "People won't understand. They'll mock you, despise you. Hide it. Hide it, Elijah." And so he had. For decades, he had hidden behind the pulpit, behind Scripture, behind a reputation of righteousness. He had convinced himself that God's call on his life excused the secret, that his devotion in every other way would outweigh what he could not reveal. But now, sitting alone in the wreckage, he saw how fragile that illusion had been. The church, once his fortress, was turning against him. Half the congregation demanded his resignation. The deacons argued openly about his character. The whispers of scandal drowned out the hymns. Even the children who used to run to him after service now avoided his gaze. He rose from the chair and walked to the mirror across the room. The man staring back at him looked older than his years, his eyes sunken, his jaw clenched. He pressed his hands against the glass, whispering bitterly, "Who are you? A pastor? A fraud? Or just a man cursed from birth?" Tears streaked down his cheeks, though he fought them back with clenched fists. For the first time in decades, he did not feel like a servant of God, or even a man of faith. He felt like a child again, afraid, ashamed, unworthy. He dropped to his knees, his voice hoarse as he prayed, "God, forgive me. Forgive me for lying. Forgive me for failing her. Forgive me for failing you." His sobs filled the room, heavy and desperate. But even as the words left his lips, he wondered if forgiveness was possible when the truth had already torn apart not only his marriage, but his ministry. Hours passed as he stayed there, kneeling, broken. At last, he rose slowly, exhausted, his body aching with the weight of confession unspoken. He glanced once more at the Bible on his desk, whispering, maybe tomorrow you'll answer." But deep down, Elijah knew tomorrow would not bring comfort. It would bring more whispers, more judgment, and more of the heavy silence that now seemed to define his life. Rebecca had not planned to speak publicly. After filing for divorce, her intention had been simple: retreat, heal, and rebuild her life quietly. But in a town like Willow Creek, silence was impossible. Her name was on everyone's lips, at the post office, at the grocery store, whispered in church parking lots. She had become the subject of every rumor, painted as either a courageous woman of principle or a heartless wife who humiliated her pastor. By the end of the week, she realized the story was no longer hers to control. If she remained silent, others would continue to twist it. And if she wanted dignity, if she wanted the truth to matter, she would have to claim her own voice. So when a local reporter knocked on her door, notebook in hand, Rebecca hesitated only a moment before inviting him in. She poured him coffee, sat across the kitchen table, and folded her hands tightly to keep them from trembling. "I didn't want this," she began, her voice calm but steady. "I never wanted to hurt Elijah or embarrass him. But I also cannot live a lie. Not for him, not for the church, not for anyone. The reporter leaned forward. People are saying the marriage ended because of something deeply personal he kept from you. Do you want to comment on that? Rebecca drew a long breath, her eyes flicking toward the window as though searching for courage in the quiet street outside. All I'll say is this: a marriage must be built on truth. When the truth is hidden, the foundation crumbles. I walked away because I refused to live with deception. That's the beginning and the end of it. Her words, printed in the local paper 2 days later, hit Willow Creek like a thunderclap. For some, it confirmed their suspicions and deepened their sympathy. For others, it sounded like betrayal, proof that she had dragged a private matter into the open. At the diner, voices clashed louder than ever. "She's brave," one woman declared. "Took courage to do what she did." Most would have kept quiet just to save face. But across the booth, another shot back. Courage? No, that's cruelty. She's torn down a good man in front of the whole town. If she loved him, she would have kept her mouth shut. The debate spilled beyond Willow Creek, carried into nearby towns by word of mouth and the newspaper's wide circulation. Suddenly, Rebecca was no longer just a widow who remarried a pastor. She had become a symbol of something larger. To some, she represented honesty and a woman's right to demand truth in marriage. To others, she was a cautionary tale of pride and unforgiveness. Rebecca felt the weight of it each time she walked down Main Street. Some neighbors offered her warm smiles, pressing her hands in solidarity. Others turned their faces away, lips pursed in judgment. It was as though every step she took was under a spotlight. One evening, she attended a small Bible study at a friend's house. The women circled around with open Bibles, but instead of discussing scripture, they looked at her with expectation. "Rebecca," one asked softly, "do you regret speaking out? Wouldn't it have been easier to stay silent?" Rebecca set her hands on the table, her voice low but firm. "Silence is what got us here. Silence is what kept the truth hidden for decades. I can't live under silence anymore. Maybe some of you think I've done wrong, but I'd rather be called cruel for telling the truth than be called faithful for living a lie." The room fell quiet. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked down at their laps, conflicted. That night, alone in her bed, Rebecca stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She knew she had lit a fire she could not put out. But for the first time since her wedding night, she did not feel like a victim. She felt like a woman reclaiming her life, her voice, and her right to be whole. And though the town remained divided, Rebecca whispered into the darkness, "If this is the cost of honesty, then so be it." The scandal that began inside a quiet parsonage bedroom soon grew beyond anything Willow Creek had ever witnessed. At first it was just the town's gossip mill turning at full speed, but within weeks the story spread across county lines, making its way into pulpits, small-town newspapers, and even talk radio shows that thrived on controversy. What had begun as one woman's decision to leave her husband became a flashpoint for arguments about faith, honesty, and the sanctity of marriage. In Willow Creek itself, the community split into camps that seemed more divided each passing Sunday. The church pews that once overflowed with unity now carried visible fractures. One side sat with arms crossed and eyes narrowed, waiting for Elijah to step down. The other sat forward, Bibles open, insisting his suffering was a test from God and that judgment should be left to heaven. "You can't preach truth and live a lie." Deacon Harris thundered during one church meeting, his face flushed red. "Our pastor has misled us. If he's not honest in his own home, how can he lead the house of God?" But Mrs. Whitfield rose from her seat, her hands shaking but her voice sharp. "Every one of us has a burden we hide. Do we demand the pastor confess every scar, every shame? God's mercy is bigger than human weakness. Are we so perfect we can throw him away? The congregation erupted, voices clashing in a storm that echoed off the sanctuary walls. It was no longer just about Elijah or Rebecca. It was about the very fabric of what faith meant. Was it about grace and forgiveness, or about accountability and truth? Rebecca stayed home during those stormy Sundays. She had made her decision and filed her papers. She had no desire to sit in a pew and become the object of judgmental stares. But even in her absence, her name was on every tongue. For some, she was a heroine who had stood against deception. For others, she was Jezebel incarnate, tearing down a man of God and bringing scandal on the church. One afternoon, a letter arrived at her door. She unfolded it with trembling hands. The handwriting was shaky, belonging to an older woman from the congregation. "Dear Rebecca," it read, "I want you to know I believe you did the right thing. I've lived my own marriage in silence, hiding my husband's cruelty for years, afraid of what the town would say. You gave me courage. Maybe someday I'll find my voice too." Tears filled Rebecca's eyes as she folded the letter carefully. She realized then that her decision, painful as it was, had rippled outward in ways she never intended. Her truth had become a mirror for others, uncomfortable, yes, but also freeing. Meanwhile, Elijah's world shrank smaller by the day. Attendance at church dwindled. Families who once sought his counsel now avoided his gaze at the grocery store. The deacons called for his resignation, and though he resisted at first, his strength faltered. One Wednesday evening, after a particularly heated meeting, he stood before the remaining congregation, voice hollow, and announced he would be stepping down. "I thought my service, my prayers, my sacrifices might outweigh my flaws," he confessed, his eyes glassy. "But the truth I hid has undone me. I ask only for your forgiveness." Some wept openly. Others left without a word. By the end of the month, Willow Creek's beloved pastor was gone, retreating into the shadows, leaving the pulpit vacant and the church divided. The scandal, however, did not die. In coffee shops and living rooms, in letters to the editor and whispered conversations after Bible study, the debate lingered. What defined a marriage? What defined a pastor? Was Rebecca cruel, or was she courageous? Was Elijah a hypocrite, or a man trapped by the hand life had dealt him? The answers depended on who you asked, and no one seemed willing to budge. Families argued at dinner tables, friendships cooled, and for the first time in decades, Willow Creek no longer felt like one community, but two separate camps living side by side. Rebecca, sitting by her window one evening, listened to the distant hum of the town and felt both weary and unshaken. She had lost her husband after less than a day, lost the favor of many neighbors, and gained the scorn of people she once called friends. Yet she had also gained something she had not expected, her voice. She whispered into the dark, steady and unyielding, "If truth costs me everything, I will still pay the price." The marriage was over. The pastor had fallen, and Willow Creek would never be the same.